Welcome back to Hot Takes and Deep Dives. This is Jess. And guys, I have a returning favorite. I'm here with Andy Bellatti, aka Astrology with Andy. Hey, Andy.
Hey, great to be here.
How are you doing today?
I am doing very well. I'm very excited to look at some more birth charts and analyze them.
Yes, we are fresh off of our Brittany episode, and we have already recorded the Christina episode, which is going to come out in the very near future for the 10th anniversary of Bionic.
Oh, wow. What a milestone. I love it. I love it.
And Andy, we had you on an episode a couple of months ago where you did the birth charts for a lot of the Roni cast, but that was in a pre-Leah McSweeney world. So today we're going to focus on Leah McSweeney, Denise Richards, Stassi, because there's a lot going on, and I just want to know how it's reflected in her chart. And also, I also asked you to take a look at Erika Jayne, just out of curiosity, and you said that there was actually a lot of interesting stuff in her chart.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
We'll get into that. And just to remind everybody, well, first of all, Andy is my best friend from college, but he has been practicing astrology you've been doing this for like 17, 20 years. Like, how long?
Yeah, I started reading charts as a hobby in 2002, so 18 years, but I launched my actual business in 2019.
Andy over the years has read my chart at this point like several times, and you do have a remarkable ability to really hit the nail on the head, as well as explain things in a very plain English way, because it can get a little confusing with like the planets and the aspects, and I finally I really understand at this point the sun, moon, and rising and how those all work together to make up a person. And I understand like composite charts.
Yeah, the composite chart is basically the mathematical average of two people's charts, and it tells you details about the relationship as a whole. The other thing that you do with relationships is called synastry, and that's when you compare two people's charts side by side and see how their planets interact with each other's.
Right. And I remember that's what we did for the Vanderpump cast. Remember last time we were doing like Jax and Brittany and the Tom and Jax, like their friendship synastry. Yeah. Remember we were doing that. I quickly want to tell everybody about this blog post that you recently wrote. It came out in April because a lot of people are turning to you and other astrologers to kind of look for answers about this sort of insane year that we've all been through with COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. And can you talk about, in this article, you did predict a spike in cases for mid to late June of 2020, and obviously that all came to fruition. Can you kind of summarize what you had talked about in that article?
Yeah, so one thing that I had been talking about since 2019 was that there was a very significant astrological aspect that happened in January of 2020. And I was talking about it since the spring of 2019, letting people know that what was happening essentially in January of 2020 was Saturn and Pluto meeting up in Capricorn, which basically translates to, as I titled that particular post, foundational collapse. It had to do with the way the structures and systems that we were used to breaking down so we can rebuild new ones. And then once COVID started in April, I wrote a post and I explained in the actual blog post why, but the period between June 6th and July 13th had a lot of activity because, there's certain planets that have to do with viruses and other planets that have to do with things intensifying. And based on that looked like a time that I thought we would see more cases, and sure thing, here we are.
And I guess just astrologically speaking, what does the rest of 2020 look like?
The next 5 months, so pretty much between now and the end of Thanksgiving, we are all in a bit of a holding pattern because there's going to be a lot of retrograde planets. Now, planets don't actually move backwards. It just looks that way from our vantage point here on Earth. But regardless, even that optical illusion has astrological significance. And it's common to have maybe two planets retrograding at the same time. But for the rest of 2020, at one point, we're going to have 6 planets all retrograding. And what that does is set up an environment where we're encouraged to slow things down, analyze, take 2 steps backward so we can then take a step forward. Once Thanksgiving comes around, late November, early December, there's a huge shift, and then things are going to move very rapidly. So the way that I describe it is that the next 5 months or so are kind of like an 8-lane highway full of cars that is now narrowing down to 1 lane. And then once we get to December, the 8 lanes are available to us again. So people should know that really until Thanksgiving, things might take longer than usual. Don't get impatient. Just let things unfold naturally. And especially because in September, October, and the first half of November, we're going to have the planet Mars in retrograde. And Mars is about action and assertiveness and things moving forward. When that retrogrades, things really slow down to a crawl. And if anybody who's listening is an entrepreneur, you should know that Mars retrograde is the absolute worst time to launch a new venture. So keep that in mind.
Ooh. So shifting over to Housewives. Well, let me ask you, do you want to start with Denise? I'll give you your choice. Do you want to start with Denise or Stassi?
Let's start with Denise. Let's do all the Housewives first, and then we'll wrap up with Stassi.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, give me like Denise's 3 big signs.
And by the way, for Denise Richards, I do have an actual birth time. So in her case, I can actually tell you her rising sign or ascendant. Denise Richards, Sun in Aquarius, Moon in Scorpio, and Taurus rising or Taurus ascendant. So here's one thing already about her chart. Let me explain 2 concepts. One is called elements and one is called modalities. Elements are fire, air, earth, and water. Okay, so case in point, we have 3 fire signs, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. We have 3 water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. We also then have what are called modalities. There's 3 of them. There's cardinal, fixed, and mutable. So the fixed signs in particular are worth bringing up here because Denise has her sun, Mercury, the midheaven, which we'll talk about in a minute, Saturn, and her rising sign, and her moon, all in fixed signs. Her chart is heavy in fixed signs. What that means is that people who have a lot of fixed energy in their chart are people who are very loyal, people who once they start something, they stick with it and they like to see it through. But the thing they have to watch is that fixed signs can be very stubborn, and they can also get really caught up with wanting to control everything. And because they can really clamp down on something once they're really into it, it can be very hard for them to be flexible. So that's especially one thing that stood out in her chart. Some people's charts are very balanced across all the modalities. Hers is very heavy in fixed energy.
I quickly wanted to ask you, actually, before we continue with Denise's chart, what did you think of the episode with Erika's astrologer?
With Sean?
Yes.
I thought Sean did a good job. I mean, here's the thing. I am sure that Sean said a lot more than what we heard. I am sure that he probably had more insightful things to say that probably got left on the editing room floor. But there was nothing he said where that, that gave me pause or that I thought, what is he talking about? My only kind of regret is that, and this is par for the course, when I do an astrology reading for somebody, it's an hour and a half, sometimes an hour and 45 minutes. And obviously in an episode like that, we got just a tiny little glimpse. So I don't think it represented the accuracy per se or like how detailed astrology can get. But I thought he did a good job with what I saw.
I was actually very impressed that they listed, the sun, moon, and rising. I was like, God damn, bravo! Like you actually are doing this justice. I did.
Yeah,
I
that's
did
true.
Like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm glad also because sometimes in other episodes they've just had psychics who just kind of sit there and just say things. But it was nice that this actually was really organized with graphics and all that. So I thought it was great.
So tell me what other insights you see in Denise's chart and how we may see that reflected in her relationships with Charlie Sheen and with Aaron, her new husband. Yeah.
Totally. So The one thing is that, Denise has her sun and Mercury in Aquarius and her midheaven in Aquarius, a lot of Aquarius energy. Aquarius it's always ahead of the curve. Aquarius also is very much about freedom, their own personal freedom. Aquarius is the kind of energy that's also actually very interested in things like science and technology and looking at things from an unconventional way. The key word for Aquarius is unconventional. They don't go with the pack.
Well, that definitely makes sense for Denise Richards. I mean, look who she's married to. Both people.
Yeah, no, exactly. And furthermore, what's very interesting is that, so in a birth chart, you have your rising sign or ascendant. That is where your first house of you begins. Who am I? That's the first house. Directly opposite that, you have the seventh house of relationships. And that is where the descendant is located, which has a lot of significance. Her descendant, where her seventh house of relationships begins, is in Scorpio. That's also where she has her moon. So that's important because the descendant often tells us about what you are attracted to in partners. And with Scorpio, we're talking about emotionally intense relationships, especially with her moon in Scorpio. The moon is about what we need to feel emotionally nourished. People with the moon in Scorpio, number one, there's a whole thing about privacy that's huge to them. They're not really an open book.
Oh, this is why he was saying, "Oh, Denise, you have a lot of secrets." And Rena was like, "Mm-hmm."
Totally. Yeah, because the moon in Scorpio, they need certain things to keep to themselves. There's other moons that actually are the opposite, where they feel like if they keep things to themselves, they get really restless. They're like, I got to share this with a bunch of people. Not so the moon in Scorpio, but also with the descendant in Scorpio, it means that she's attracted to people who are very emotionally intense and with whom there's this, once the bond is created, it is a bond that goes so deep where they show each other, they have no problem showing each other the worst of themselves. That's the kind of relationships that Denise Richards needs in order for her chart to feel acknowledged and validated. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What's also interesting is that in her seventh house, the house of relationships, she has two planets conjunct. Conjunct means right on top of each other. She has Neptune and Jupiter. This is important because Jupiter basically acts like a magnifying glass. Whatever Jupiter is sitting next to, it blows up 100 times. Neptune has to do, on the one hand, with idealistic, romantic love that is unconditional. However, Neptune also rules addictions, and it rules people who are not really rooted in reality. Mm-hmm. So when you have Jupiter conjunct Neptune in your seventh house, on the one hand, you can actually have a romantic relationship that is truly the epitome of unconditional love, but you can also be really attracted to people who have severe issues and especially addiction issues.
Very, very interesting. So I'm curious, is there anything, I don't know if you'll be able to find this. I know you have like a little calculator where you can like kind of plug in dates because I've seen you do this. So they filmed this season of Beverly Hills between September of 2019 and December of 2019. So this is around the time, I know for a fact it was in November when they were in Rome that the affair with Brandy became exposed and she basically walked off the set of Beverly Hills. So what I'm asking you is there anything that you see sort of in the past that you saw that would indicate that there was sort of turmoil in her life during that period?
Yeah, there's two things in her chart during that time. I'm looking at, so the date that I have here is November 10th of 2019. Mm-hmm. It's close enough because, also in astrology, what I think is worth telling people is that in astrology, I look at planetary cycles that at the shortest last a few weeks. So an astrology chart is not going to be one where suddenly on Tuesday you have one thing and then 2 days later on Thursday it's totally different. Anything that is significant is in effect, I would say, for at least 4 weeks. In Denise's case, there's two things here. One is that in November of 2019, she had the planet Saturn sitting right on top of her Venus. And this is important because Venus has to do with, among other things, romantic relationships. And Saturn is the planet of karma. Now, I don't mean karma in a negative sense, like what comes around or whatever, what goes around comes around, and all the bad things you do come back to you. I simply mean that when Saturn comes around, whatever has been not quite out in the light usually does come out. So Saturn on Venus, which, by the way, only happens about every 28 years. So it's not like it happens, every 10 days. When Saturn is on Venus, relationships, especially romantic ones, both present and past, come under the spotlight. And whatever has to be addressed comes to light, so it has to be addressed. In addition to that, she had the planet Neptune square, meaning 90 degrees away from her Mars. And this also happens, this happens every 100 or so years, a very rare transit. But Neptune has to do with secrets. And so when it squares Mars, Mars is about energy and Mars is about action. And she has Mars in her 7th house of relationships. So when I see Neptune square Mars, I see the potential for some drama. That's Mars. In regards to secrets, Neptune, that are now coming to light. And when I look at that Saturn-Venus happening simultaneously, that definitely looks like an active time. And to be clear, if Denise had come to me, say at the beginning of 2019, I would not, because I'm not a psychic, I would not have said, in November of 2019, a supposed affair you had with Brandy Glanville will come to light. I wouldn't say that.
Right.
But what I would say is, later in the second half of 2019, relationships are really coming to light. Maybe things from the past will reemerge. So that's the amount of detail that I would give. I don't want anybody thinking that as an astrologer, I'm going to really tell you exactly what's going to happen in your future.
That is fascinating. Yeah, they were actually in Rome that 3rd week of November.
Wow, that's so interesting. And one more thing about Denise's chart before we wrap up.
Yes.
Because, the moon represents the mother figure, and she has her moon opposite in her birth chart. The moon opposite, meaning 180 degrees away from Saturn. And that usually means that growing up, there was tension between you and your mother, or the mother was seen as a very authoritative figure, or simply was not able to give you what you needed emotionally. I don't know if that has come up in the season, but when I look at this chart, there's definitely something there with the mother that that if she were a client of mine, I'd want to explore.
I don't know if her mother is alive. Like, I know that in that other show she did, Denise Richards, It's Complicated, on, maybe it was E! I know that her father lived with her. I don't know what the deal is with I don't even know if her mother's alive. She may very well be, but I don't know.
Interesting. Okay. If any listeners know, let us know.
Yeah, let us know. I can Google this too. Okay, moving on. Should we move on to, I guess, since, you know what, let's move on to Leah McSweeney.
Let's do it.
First of all, give me your hot take on Leah. Fresh Roni wife. You are a Roni scholar, after all. You're packing a bag,
Yes.
you're running, you're leaving, you're going to Florida,
right.
You're packing a bag.
Yeah, mother's not happy. Not happy.
So tell me, do you like Leah?
Well,
Oh my God, I'm going to kill you. You don't like Leah?
It's not that I dislike her. She's a little bit much for me sometimes. At least, especially the episode at the Hamptons, at Ramona's house.
The tiki torch, where she's throwing the tiki torches. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I guess what I do appreciate about her is that, she definitely, to me, what it comes down to is that I think a lot of these newer housewives are very aware of the camera, and they're very aware that if they are quote unquote boring, they won't come back for another season. And what I see in her a little bit is a little bit of really trying hard to stand out around these women who already are. If you're on Sonia Morgan and you have to stand out, you got to bring it up to like a crazy level of 50. I have a very low threshold for that.
I understand. So what I know of Leah McSweeney is that she's in fact a Virgo.
She is, correct. So very interesting chart, because in her case, she has her sun in Virgo, but her moon is in Sagittarius. And that's interesting because Virgo and Sagittarius are square one another. They're 90 degrees away from each other. So And the sun is our wants, the moon is our needs. When people have the sun and the moon in signs that are square each other, that gives a lot of internal conflict, where usually we want something, but what we need is completely different from that. So one example, hypothetically, would be somebody saying something like, I want to at some point live abroad. Totally different continent, but I need to be close to my family to feel happy. That's the kind of energy that you have when you have your sun and moon not really getting along. Usually as well, sun moon squares are people who grew up in families where the parents didn't get along. That doesn't have to necessarily mean divorcing or huge fights, but at the very least, mom and dad were so different that the person with this chart growing up felt very torn. Kind of like, to please mom, I have to do X, but then to please dad, I have to do Y. And there's this constant sense of diverging interests, diverging needs, diverging traits within us that don't really match. Mm-hmm. Now, the moon in Sagittarius is all about freedom.
Well, you know that her parents they kicked her out of the house. Her story is that she was kind of a juvenile delinquent. Like, she was like on drugs, and like she, I think, got sober from like an early age. Like, she was a juvenile delinquent. Her parents sent her someplace to live immediately after high school. Because they like couldn't handle her, or maybe it was even during high school. Like, they like shipped her out of the house to live somewhere. And so I think she had a lot of strife with the parents when she was young, because she was going through a lot as a young teen.
And that totally, there's two things about what you just said that totally show up in her chart. And I actually have this in my notes. The first one is that she has her sun in a square, again, 90 degrees, to the planet Uranus. When you think of a square, think of two planets. I know the sun is not a planet. Please don't at me. It says that in astrology, we just call the sun and the moon planets just for ease of reference. I'm not that ignorant. Just in case anybody's like, seriously, dude?
Andy's getting surly.
Yeah, just saying. So when you have the sun and Uranus in square, you can think of that as them not really getting along. So Uranus, one of the positive qualities, as I was saying earlier, is that, Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius, it's about thinking outside the box, being forward thinking, being progressive. Somebody who's very much about civil rights usually has a lot of Uranus in their chart. However, when Uranus is involved in a square, as it is in Leah's chart, squaring her sun, that's when initially, especially when we're younger, this energy is harder to integrate. So we experience the more negative side of Uranus, which is the rebel without a cause. So people who have sun square Uranus are people who, growing up, one of two things happen. Either you feel like a total black sheep because you're totally different, or you are a rebel to an extreme and you just are constantly defying rules and defying authority. So there's that aspect.
Dude, this is Leah.
There you go. Sun square Uranus. Now, I will say this, because I always say to my clients, astrology is not an excuse to justify bad behavior, right? So you can't say, I'm a total maniac because I have Uranus square the sun. So again, this is where my client, what I would suggest to them is that you got to embrace Uranus. So embrace how you are alternative and different, but do it in a way where you're not just constantly bumping up and clashing against people. Mm-hmm. She also has a lot of Neptune. So here's what I mean by that. Her moon is conjunct, sitting very close to Neptune, and she has Neptune squaring, once again, challenging aspect, her Mercury. Whenever somebody has Neptune so prominent in a chart, I always go to escapism and, once again, addiction. Because Neptune, when it's acting the way it is in this chart, the default, I always tell people too, your birth chart is like the default factory settings on your phone. What it shows me is what you default to emotionally if you're not very aware. Once you're aware, you can change things. But the default in this chart is to escape. And there can be healthy escape, like exercise or meditation or taking walks. But when you have so much Neptune, the default here can be to escape in an unhealthy way. That can be through substances or unhealthy behaviors, or even through just denial.
You're reading Leah to a T. And even down to the thing that you said about being a civil rights activist, she is very politically active and has been for many, many years preceding Housewives. Like she's written many articles. Like she's been very vocal about the Me Too movement, and she is also something I want to say. This has not yet come up on the show, and I don't know if something like this would be in her chart, but something I just want to throw out there so you have a little bit more insight is she wrote an article about being bipolar. So I think that she has battled some mental health stuff. I think that she's a complicated, very interesting person.
So that's very interesting because, and let me just say this too for legal reasons, and I made this very clear on my website, I am not a therapist, I am not a doctor. An astrological reading does not substitute as therapy. But I will say that, in astrology, especially the moon has to do with emotions. And when you have the moon and Neptune interacting in certain ways, like it is in Leah's chart, that usually does indicate a propensity for mental health issues, because Neptune has to do with detaching from reality. And so one way that it can manifest, for example, can be with addiction, but another way it can manifest is with certain mental health conditions where you're not entirely maybe present, right? Or the way you perceive things might be a little bit off. So I definitely have seen that, and I've read it in many of my astrology textbooks where Moon-Neptune aspects can sometimes point to that.
For people who are just curious about this, so I want to just back this up. I want to let people know. So Leah wrote this article herself on hypebae.com, hypebae.com in 2016. The title of the article is Manic McSweeney, My Love Affair with My Bipolar II Disorder. Married to the Moms, Leah McSweeney honestly addresses mental health. And then she goes on to write it's quite a long article, and I recommend everybody check this out.
You know what's interesting, by the way, with her Sagittarius moon, Sagittarius, number one, is very much an open book. And oftentimes the Sagittarius moons, these are people, unlike the Scorpio moon that we were talking about earlier, that's very secretive.
Denise.
The Sagittarius moon, Denise, right. The Sagittarius moon, which Leah has, is very much about, you know what, it's all about honesty. I'm going to just be truthful. I'm going to just share everything. So that also, the fact that she wrote that article, which takes a lot of bravery to do, that is very much in line with her Sagittarius moon.
Should we move on to, so you want to do Erika Jayne before we do Stassi?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Because you had said that there's some, because guys, I had floated a few ideas to Andy, and you're like, and one of them was Erika Jayne. I was like, listen, let's only do it if there's something, like if you have something to say, and you're like, we have to do Erika Jayne. So tell me. I mean, yeah. I love Erika. In fact, you and I saw her live and in person at the opening night of Christina Aguilera's residency in Vegas. Remember, Erika was standing right in front of us?
Yeah, Planet Hollywood with that unmistakable ponytail.
Yep. Sipping champagne.
Sipping champagne, and let's not forget getting her makeup touched up in between Christina's numbers.
Yep.
Which is fantastic.
Amazing.
I mean, that's just beautiful. And it's funny because it's also so in her chart.
Oh my God, tell me.
All right, so let's start with that. So she has, I'm looking here at the planet Jupiter. Jupiter is also about abundance and things being larger than life. And so she has Jupiter conjunct Neptune, and Neptune is about glamour, among other things, and beauty. So, Jupiter conjunct Neptune people usually can be very over the top with their looks, in the sense, it's not about necessarily being showy or tacky, but there's a whole thing here about refinement and glamour, but very over the top, that is in her chart. She also has her sun trining 120 degrees, which is a supportive aspect to Jupiter. People who have Sun Jupiter aspects are people who tend to like things larger than life and over the top. They're not wallflowers. So there's that element as well. She has her Mercury in Leo. It's interesting because Leo is a fire sign. Leo is very expressive, and Mercury is about, communication and thought processes. And when people have this placement, Mercury in Leo, they need attention. There's something, Leo is about, Leo is ruled by the sun, which is, that's like the number one source of light. So people with Mercury and Leo definitely, again, not wallflower types. With that being said, what's really interesting about her chart is that she has her sun in Cancer. So deep down, she's very protective of her family.
This is exactly right. I mean, she has a son who's a cop, and she's been very, very like quiet about who he is and like his protecting, just protecting his identity. Like she only recently shared like one photo of him.
Yeah. So it's funny because, people might think that just because she's on stage and all this, but no, like, her chart really shows a pretty significant desire for privacy. As much as Mercury and Leo is about attention, but Mercury is not about emotions. It's about how I communicate. So Mercury and Leo can be very dramatic in their words, but that's different from wanting attention on your emotions. Does that make sense? Like, it's not an open book about what I'm feeling. It's more about, I just want to be the center of attention in general, but don't get too close and don't ask me too many questions.
But this is exactly all along what has been the audience's criticism of Erika, that she hasn't been open enough. And it's actually only now this season that the audience is sort of re-embracing her as being like, oh, she I don't know, she like cried a few times on camera, and the audience is sort of opening their arms again to her. She's having like a very good season. People are like really enjoying because she's showing vulnerability again.
That's so interesting, because also what I will say is that she also has her moon in Aquarius. And I forget what season it was, but there was one season where her tagline was, some people say I'm cold, but that's not ice, it's diamonds. Wasn't that one of her? Okay.
Yeah.
And in reality, what it should have been is, some people say I'm cold, but that's not ice, it's my Aquarius moon. Because because that's what it is. Because here's the thing. The moon is about our emotions, right? And whatever sign the moon is in tells me, how do you share your emotions, if at all? Aquarius is the most emotionally detached sign. Aquarius is all about, well, one of two things. If it's an unhealthy Aquarius moon, the second that things get too intense, it just runs. It bolts. The most positive Aquarius moon aspect is that when things get really intense, they're able to keep their cool and help people who are more distressed to get it together. So the fact that Erika Jayne shed tears in front of a camera for an Aquarius moon, that is monumental. If she was a Pisces moon, I'd be like, well, yeah, she'll cry at everything. Uh-huh. But for an Aquarius moon to cry, like, I can't tell you how difficult that is, because showing vulnerability for an Aquarius moon is extremely difficult. Also, by the way, she has Uranus square Venus. So, again, Uranus is about things that are unconventional. Venus is relationships. And this is a square. So usually 9 times out of 10, when somebody has Uranus square Venus, they have a romantic relationship that is very unconventional. And that could be that your partner is significantly older. It could also mean that your partner is significantly younger. It could mean that you're in an open relationship. It could mean many things. But it doesn't surprise me that she's with somebody who is so much older when she has Uranus, unconventional, squaring Venus, her romantic planet.
Mm-hmm. It makes complete sense, astrologically speaking. All right, let's move on to the grand finale. A woman who has had a lot of tumult. I would love to know her, Jesus, I mean, just what has been depicted in her chart for the past, I guess, like 3 months. I mean, like, would any of this be reflected in the chart?
Oh, absolutely. I'm really glad that I was able to find Stassi's time of birth, because here's the thing.
Tell people how you found her time of birth.
Oh, yeah. So I was Googling and I came across a tweet from 2015 where she was asked by somebody for this reason. Somebody actually asked her, I want to do your astrological chart. What's your time of birth? And Stassi actually replied with her time of birth. That was great. And here's why. Because what Stassi has gone through in the past few months comes down to her, we can say, her reputation or her public persona being very affected.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of, if we look at the past few months, it's been actually like great success. Like, she was headlining a tour, like she has sold out dates. She's writing her second book, and then this mammoth PR catastrophe sort of hits her out of nowhere.
Yeah. So here's what happened. And, whenever somebody is going through major changes in their career or their public life, I immediately think about the midheaven, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast. The midheaven is a very sensitive angle, much like the ascendant or the descendant, which I've spoken about earlier. But the midheaven is where the 10th house of career begins. And anytime one of these sensitive angles, like the midheaven, gets a lot of action from planets, you can be sure that something is going to be happening in that realm. Again, I would not be able to know Stassi's midheaven if I didn't know her time of birth. So this is key. Now, let me step back for a second and talk about the what relates to her having, a lot of success recently. That has to do with the fact that over the past several months, she had the planet Jupiter in her first house. And that happens roughly every 12 years. Jupiter is about abundance. Jupiter expands. And usually when Jupiter is in the first house, that is a 12-month period of new beginnings, new starts, and general expansion in your life in general. However, what she also has, and she's going to have this for the rest of 2020, but it's been active pretty much since April, is the planet Saturn squaring her midheaven. Again, a square is 90 degrees, and that is challenging. That's a challenging aspect where there's some tension. Now, this particular aspect, Saturn squaring her midheaven, the last time she had it was 14 years ago. So again, in astrology, the less frequently something happens, the more weight we give it. So the midheaven is a very sensitive angle about how am I perceived publicly. It's also your career. When Saturn squares, again, think about what I was saying earlier with Denise Richards and Saturn on her Venus, and things from the past coming up that have to be re-examined. Well, the same thing is happening with Stassi, but with her midheaven, her career. At the very least, Saturn square your midheaven is a time when there are blocks in your career, when maybe you're working twice as hard and only getting half the kudos, or where you are pushing twice as hard and getting half as far. But at the worst, Saturn square the midheaven can bring things to an end, because Saturn can definitely cut things out of your life if they're no longer serving a purpose. So I always talk about how in astrology, if Saturn ends up removing something from your life, 9 times out of 10, it is something that 2 or 3 years later you look back and maybe you're not glad of how it happened, but you're actually glad that thing is out of your life, because as a result, maybe another door opened. Mm-hmm. When you're going through it, it's very challenging, but that is what was happening. And I knew it. I was like, considering just how much went down with her, I was like, her midheaven has to have some kind of aspect. And I thought it's either Saturn or Pluto. And sure enough, the second that chart came up on my laptop, I was like, boom, Saturn square midheaven. Makes perfect sense. And that's what happened in her chart.
And tell me more about, I guess, what you see as far as like her career moving forward, and also the fact that she's now pregnant and due in January. The fact that
right.
The fact that suddenly she's pregnant during the time of this career upheaval.
So here's what's very interesting about that. So you have the midheaven where the 10th house of career begins. Directly opposite that, there's another sensitive angle known as the IC. That's where the 4th house of home and family begins, which means that when a planet is doing something to your midheaven, it's also doing something to your IC. So in this case, Stassi has Saturn squaring her midheaven, and I just talked about how that affected her career, but she also has Saturn square her IC. And usually, again, 9 times out of 10, whenever Saturn affects your IC, there is either a move or there's a change relating to the status of your family. And that could mean either your actual parents or it could mean whatever family you have. And with Saturn being the planet of responsibility, a lot of times Saturn squaring the IC can indicate pregnancy or a child coming into the family, because that obviously, that adds a whole new level of responsibilities to your life. So I thought it was very interesting that in her case, both of those sensitive angles were affected, because, usually at least one of them will be affected, either career or family. In her case, it was clearly both. Now, as far as moving forward, I do think that in some way, shape, or form, Stassi will have a new chapter beginning. And I say that because we had a solar eclipse on June 20th, and her birthday is June 24th. Whenever there's a solar eclipse on your actual birthday, or if your birthday is within 4 days after a solar eclipse, that means that the coming year has a lot of new beginnings for you. So I would say there's more to come. I don't think she's fully finished.
No,
I have no idea what it will entail.
Of course she's not fully finished. No, I was saying how this actually could be the best thing that ever happened to her, because it just forced the inevitable, which is that Vanderpump Rules is going to come to an end and she needs to figure out the next step. And I said on here with my episode with Laura Marie Shaneholes that I could see her as a panel on a show like The Talk or The View. Being a pundit of some kind, a pop culture pundit.
And, with her Mercury and Gemini, that would be she would fit into that role so well. She has Mercury and Gemini. Mercury and Gemini can talk about anything to anyone without even a script. Mercury and Gemini, you just give them a topic and they will just talk about it. Mercury and Gemini is also very witty. They're people who have the gift of gab. And she also has Mercury conjunct her Venus. Again, conjunct means right next to each other. Mercury conjunct Venus means that you also have the way that you speak is well received by people. You say things in a way that is easy for people to understand. So, her chart is one that has that shows a lot of talent and skill for that. But there's the thing, Saturn square your midheaven. Saturn is the planet of reckoning. And so this is why I always talk about, there's something called a Saturn return in astrology. The first one happens when you were around 28 years old, second one about 56. And, Saturn is the adulting planet in astrology, which is why astrologically we're not adults until 28 years old. And the Saturn return is usually a time in your life when you have a significant milestone. It could be an engagement, it could be a wedding, it could be that you're starting off your career, or that you're switching careers, or you're buying a home, or you're moving to a new city where you really lay down roots. It could be any of that. If prior to your Saturn return, you are acting like a teenager with no cares in the world, when that Saturn return comes along, you kind of get your ass kicked. However, if prior to your Saturn return, you have a certain degree of responsibility and, like a good head on your shoulders, that Saturn return can really propel you to a whole new level. My point being that with Saturn square the midheaven like Stassi had, if there was anything kind of lurking that you were not addressing, it comes to light as a reality check so that you kind of have a chance to refocus, get your shit together, and restart. So I'm not surprised that this happened during a Saturn aspect, because Saturn is that planet that comes along and is like, what are you doing? Come on, get it together.
Very, very interesting. Any final thoughts?
Well, the other thing I want to talk about with Stassi, by the way, is that right now, and she has it for about 6 more months, but she's had it for a year, once in a lifetime, she has Neptune, the planet Neptune, sitting right on top of her Mars. Again, I'm not surprised, because Mars has to do with our drive, right? Mars is the gas pedal of the zodiac. When Neptune comes along, all of that energy dissipates and gets dissolved. It is very common when you have Neptune on your Mars to suddenly have your your gas run out for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the universe is forcing you to get the foot off the pedal, slow down, look around, and you really can't, you're kind of held back from moving forward momentarily, but all for a purpose. So you can really get to the heart of what matters to you and what's important to you. So I really think that for Stassi, by the time that we get to December, January, I think she's going to feel more sturdy or stable. I would say if right now she's feeling totally out of sorts, that's definitely reflected in her chart. And one more thing I want to ask about her, she has her sun opposite Saturn. Usually, the sun represents the father. Sun opposite Saturn usually points to a difficult relationship with the father growing up, especially where the father had such a high benchmark that there's a sense that you can never please him. So again, if she was one of my clients, I would start the reading off probably asking about that relationship.
Interesting. And actually, both of her parents have featured on the show. The dad seems to be, I know that the parents recently got divorced, and the dad seems to be like an upstanding guy. The mom seems to be a total fame whore and a bit of a mess.
Interesting. Well, she has her moon conjunct Pluto. Moon is the mother. Moon-Pluto aspects are very hard because when you have moon conjunct Pluto, it can make for a mother who can be very controlling and also a mother who can be kind of an emotional vampire.
Yes.
Who kind of either lives off of, whenever I see moon-Pluto aspects, that's the term I use, emotionally vampirical mother. And every client who has it, when I say that, they go, oh my God, yes. So,
wow.
Yeah, that shows up.
Andy, you are the best. Tell everyone where they can find you.
Yeah, 2 places. One is my website, astrologywithandy.com. If you click on services, you can look at the various readings that I offer. And that's also where you can read my blog. I post about every 3 or 4 weeks. And you can also follow me on @astrologywithandy on Instagram, where I post anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week.
And tell people what a reading with you is like.
The most common service that people request is my 90-minute natal chart reading plus year ahead reading. And what that is that for the first hour, we review your birth chart in detail. Again, a birth chart is a snapshot of the energy when you were born. It's what you default to. And the last 30 minutes, we talk about, significant events in the recent past, as well as what's happening now and what's coming up. And to be clear, when I say what's coming up, you can think of it as a GPS, where I let you know what the landscape looks like, and then you have free will to make your own decisions. But case in point, there are times when an astrology chart will make it clear, for example, that, for the next 12 months, you should just keep things status quo. Alternatively, I have charts where the next 12 months are all about actually you need to embrace change. So it's more about a general gist of how you can best work with the planetary energies over the next year.
Perfect. Guys, I really can't recommend Andy highly enough. I mean, you guys, listen to the episode that we did a few months ago if you want to hear about the Vanderpump Kids and the Roni cast. I know we did like Bethany, Dorinda, not Luann. We did
Ramona.
We did Bethany, Ramona, Dorinda, and then like Jackson, Brittany, Tom, and Ariana. It was quite good. Andy, thank you so much. You guys can follow me, JessXNYC, follow the show account, Hot Takes Deep Dives, and of course, follow Andy, Astrology with Andy. And we'll see you soon. The next time you guys hear Andy will be our famous Christina episode, and it's coming to you soon.